Question I have here. What part of your identity are you still holding on to, even though you've outgrown it? Let me first say that I don't know that you outgrow your identity. Your identity grows as you get older, as you accumulate more attachments, more responsibilities. Your identity is really the least when you're first born, when you're young, when you're a child, when you're carefree. And so as you get older, that identity grows, like, who you are, who you think you are. Your conditioning becomes your identity, right? Like what you experienced as a child, whether your mom and dad were nice, whether they got divorced and remained friends, or whether they got divorced and made life difficult for one another, whether you're how you're punished by your parents, if they hit you, if they didn't hit you, how your teachers treated you, what kind of school you went to, whether you went into the military after school, uh, what your first job was like, whether you were rejected or accepted, whether you're maybe good looking or not. There's a lot of things that condition us, and that helps create our identity. If life's been particularly difficult, maybe we identify with being the victim. Maybe we overcome those challenges. So we identify with being someone that's adaptable, um, that's tough, that's strong. We identify with work a lot, right? Like, especially in the United States, because what's one of the first things that we always ask somebody? Like, what do you do? And what do you do? First response is what you do for work, which for most people is the least interesting thing that they do. It's the thing that they care least about. But yeah, sit and have these conversations about, shit we don't care about. So your identity becomes more ingrained as you get older. I think though the question, since it's really specifically directed at me, and I've talked about uh, losing my identity, about going through this experience where I no longer knew who I was and refused to re-identify with the old Jeff. So there's this kind of dying of Jeff. I guess there's a growth there, right? There's a growth in this ego separation, this detachment from who you were, what you own, what you have. And as you kind of acknowledge that, as you see that, as you realize that you're not your thoughts. Like, what am I? Am I holding on to my thoughts? No, um, not particularly, but thoughts do still come into my head. There's a lot of momentum from old Jeff. Right? There's a lot of momentum and there's a lot of responsibilities. As you detach from things, those responsibilities still exist. But I'd say that, probably the thing that I don't want to say hold on to, but it's toughest to detach from are friends and family. And let's just kind of be clear, like when I say detach, it doesn't mean that you stop caring about something. You might, you might stop caring about something if it doesn't really have any meaning or purpose, or the attachment isn't healthy. But when I'm talking about like friends and family, uh, they're the ones that are the most attached to my identity and who I was. And there's this role that you play. And as you change, it's very difficult to have conversations with people you've known for years and decades or your whole life, if it's your family, um, because they expect you to be this certain person, play this certain role. Um, and then all of a sudden you're completely different. I would say that's probably the hardest one, the hardest thing to detach from. I have a kid, 10-year-old son. That's strong attachment, right? You do anything for your kid. Uh, but I think like when you think about like detaching from something that you care about, you really have to start examining whether or not that thing you care about is a feeling of unconditional love versus conditioned love. It's like a lot of the relationships we have are conditioned love, right? Like they're based on what someone else can do for us. So if they make us unhappy, they betray us, um, they don't do something that fits into our desires, need, um, then we dismiss them really quickly. So, um, but unconditional love doesn't have those conditions. Unconditional love doesn't expect somebody to act or behave a certain way, much less act or behave a certain way for you. So when you're talking about your kid, which is probably the easiest way to tap into a kind of unconditional love, but you do see conditioned love all the time with children. You've all heard of helicopter parents, right? Like your kid kind of becomes this expression of you, what's your kid going to do? What's the success your child's going to have? How well your kid does at sports. We become proud parents of the things that our kids accomplish, but is that pride unconditional or is that something conditional? Like is that what your kids are accomplishing? Is that feeding your ego? Um, and then if your kid doesn't do that, if your kid doesn't do the things you want him or her to do you restrict that love now? So I would say those are probably the things that my identity has held on to the longest. But I think it becomes a matter of seeing that, acknowledging it when emotions come up, when feelings come up, that are a reaction to those attachments. You start creating space. You start creating separation. Right? Uh, you see the attachment for what it is, as conditional, as a part of your ego. And when you start letting go of that attachment when it comes to friends and family, because it's so much different than something material, right? Something you don't really need. With friends and family, it allows you to go to a whole nother level of compassion and love towards them, which is a good starting point for experiencing unconditional love towards people you don't know. Then you could take it a step further and experience unconditional love to people that harm you or harm others. Doesn't mean that you accept what they do. It just means that you aren't basing that relationship on your ego, and you're connecting more with who they really are. You're connecting with them on their consciousness level, their unconditioned self. When I was a kid, I used to always think about like if I did something that I felt was altruistic or kind, or, maybe thought I was a better person than someone else. I would think to myself, well, what would I still be a better person if I had gone through everything that they had gone through? Like if I had been abused, would that have changed how I behave and react? It's like with slavery, right? Like, we have these idols like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and can't help but think, well, if you were alive in the late 1700s, would you have the same feelings towards slavery then that you do now? I mean, there were abolitionists back then. I like to believe that I would be one of those. Um, but it's easy to judge people when you have a whole separate set of conditioning than they do. Um, Without experiencing that conditioning, you don't know how you would react or how you'd behave. And I think some of that conditioning when it comes to crime and criminals and what we would describe as deprived is some of that conditioning is horrific. That gets people to those uh, to do those acts, those horrific acts. Doesn't excuse them, but it really shows the disconnect, um, from form, like how much they've identified with their form and their separation from their consciousness and who they really are.